The hands called her morning tea ditch water, and for 3 months she never corrected them. She poured the dark, bitter cup alone in the cook shack before dawn, while the men filed through and made the same flat joke about cow medicine. Then the foreman, the loudest of them, went down with a fever the town doctor couldn't break in 3 days of trying. What she poured him next wasn't the tea they'd mocked, and no one on the bar was ready for what morning brought. Stay until the end to see how one cup rewrote what an entire ranch thought of a widow they'd written off. The kerosene lantern threw an amber light across the cook shack wall, and the flame jumped every time a draft found the gap under the door. Yuka moved through that flickering light without wasting a step, setting the iron pot on the stove and feeding split pine into the firebox before the first cock crowed. She'd been the cook at the Bar H for 2 weeks, and not one man had asked her how she came to be standing in their kitchen at the far edge of Wyoming territory. They assumed she was lucky to be there, and she didn't argue with the assumption. Her husband had been a survey laborer, a quiet man from the same prefecture who had signed on with a crew mapping rail grade across the high plains. He took the fever somewhere along the North Platte, 3 weeks out from a town that had no doctor and no name worth remembering. They buried him in a sod blanket of earth beside the trail, and the crew foreman handed Yuka her husband's pay pouch and a canteen and pointed her toward the next settlement. She walked for 11 days carrying the thing he had left her, and she didn't look back at the grave because there was nothing there to look at. The trail taught her what it teaches anyone walking it alone without a man's name to wave at trouble, which is that the country doesn't care whether you live or die and won't slow its wind for either. She learned to sleep with the box under her body and to cook what she gathered off the land, and she learned that a woman who doesn't ask for help is left alone more often than she's bothered. By the time she came down out of the foothills and saw the smoke of the Bar H corrals, she had stopped expecting anything from the country except the next mile of it. The thing he had left her sat on the shelf above her cot. Now a lacquer box the color of dried blood, with brass corners worn smooth by a grandmother's hands in Kyoto. The range hands had noticed it the first day and lost interest by the second because it was too small to hold whiskey and too pretty to steal in a place where pretty things got you beaten. Yuka kept it locked with a tiny pin of a key she wore on a cord around her neck, and she opened it only when the cook shack was empty and the door was barred. Whatever lived inside that box, it mattered enough to her that she wouldn't let the frontier lay hands on it. The Bar H itself was a long, low outfit sunk into a draw where the wind broke before it reached the corrals. Hank Mosley ran it the way his father had, with a small crew, a long memory for who stayed and who quit, and a silence that the men had learned to read like a posted notice. He'd taken Yuka on because his last cook had walked off in a rainstorm, and because he couldn't stomach the sight of a widow walking the trail toward nothing in particular. He said exactly one sentence to her when he hired her, that she cooked for the crew and kept to herself, and the job was hers, as long as the bread rose. She had cooked for the crew every day since, and the bread rose every time, and the crew ate that bread without once connecting it to the woman who made it, the way a man drinks from a creek without thanking the snow. Hank was the only one who had looked at her and seen something other than a body to fill a job, and the looking had been brief and hadn't been repeated, and she had filed it the way she filed everything, without comment. She was the Japanese woman to them, the way a man might say the bay horse or the south pasture, a label that held a shape but no history. They didn't know her name was Yuka, or that the name had been spoken in a house with paper walls before she had ever seen a board fence. They didn't know she had studied under her grandmother for 9 years, or that the study had a name she'd never bothered to offer them. She poured her dark cup every morning before the stove was hot enough for coffee, and the smell of it curled out the cook shack vent like something the wind didn't want to carry. The brew was bitter in a way that sat heavy at the back of the throat. The kind of bitter that made a man's face close up before he could think better of it. She drank it in 3 slow swallows, and she rinsed the cup and set it upside down on the shelf beside the box, and she didn't explain it to anyone. There was no one to explain it to, and she'd learned, long before the trail, that explaining was a kind of begging she wouldn't do. The morning she poured that cup was the same morning she poured every other, quiet and dark, and the day ahead didn't yet know what it would ask of her. The first hand through the cook shack door was usually a rider named Wes, a tall man with a broken nose who came in, smelling of horse and cold leather and asking for coffee before his eyes were open. He stopped dead the first time he caught the bitter smell hanging in the air, his face working through confusion, and then a slow, pleased disgust, and he called the brew ditch water loud enough for the corral to hear. The word spread through the crew before breakfast was plated, and by the second morning the joke had already found its shape. Yucca set the 10 plates down and let the joke land where it wanted to land. She could have told them what the brew was for, that the bitter cold herbs cleared the heat that builds in a body through a long summer of bad water and worse meat, and that her grandmother had prescribed them in small sips for exactly the life a ranch hand lives. She didn't, because an explanation offered to a room that's already laughing is a coin thrown into a well, and she had learned to keep her coins. The brew did its work inside her, whether they understood it or not, and the understanding was a thing they'd have to come to on their own time or not at all. The mockery wasn't cruel so much as it was sport. The kind of small entertainment a lonely crew builds out of whatever is strange enough to be worth noticing. They called it cow medicine and heathen tea and the witch's morning tonic, and they said it with the flat grins of men who needed something to say before the sun came up. Yucca poured, drank, and cleared the cup without once lifting her eyes to defend it, and the stillness of her did more than any answer could have. A man who won't fight back in a bunkhouse either has no pride or has too much of it, and the crew couldn't decide which. She opened the lacquered box once that week when the hands were out on the south range and the cook shack held only heat and the smell of yesterday's bread. The lid came up on paper packets folded tight and labeled in a script that no one within 200 miles could have read, each one a dried thing, a root or a bark or a pressed leaf, faintly dusty and dark. Beside the packets lay a few tools, too fine for the frontier, a small mortar and a measure and a brush, the kind of objects that belonged in a quiet room and looked wrong on a pine shelf. She counted the packets with her eyes and closed the lid and locked it, and she didn't take any of them out. Tucker, the foreman, came back to the cook shack that afternoon for a canteen refill and caught her turning the key in the lock. He asked her what was in the pretty box, and the question came out with the grin still on it. She told him it was tea, which was true enough and not true at all, and the answer gave him less than he wanted, and he knew it. He stood in the doorway a beat too long, watching her hang the key back inside her collar, and then he laughed and went out to the crew. The box stayed locked, and the question of why a widow would bother locking anything in a cook shack where no one would steal it went unanswered. The bitter smell became a kind of weather on the bar H, something the men complained about, the way they complained about the wind. Hank passed through the cook shack one morning while Wes was doing the ditch water voice for the 3rd time, and the owner stopped in the door and let the silence do the work for him. He didn't tell them to quit, and he didn't join in, and he poured his own coffee and walked back out without looking at Yucca. The hands watched him go, and the joke got a little quieter after that, though it didn't die. She didn't thank him for it, and he didn't expect her to. The not thanking was its own kind of exchange between two people who'd agreed, without saying so, that she wouldn't be made to beg and he wouldn't be made to notice. The box sat on its shelf, locked, and the dark cup sat upside down beside it, and the morning went on the way mornings go on a ranch, with the smell of bitter brew mixing with the smell of coffee until the two became the same air. Tucker ran the crew the way a man runs a rope through a pulley, with a steady hand and a voice that carried to the back of every corral without ever being raised. He was good at the job, and he knew it, and the knowing sat in the set of his shoulders and in the way he wore his hat pushed back so he could see a man coming. He had a verbal tick that the crew could have set a watch by a flat, little reckon knot. He used to close down any argument he had already decided against. Yucca had marked the tick the first week, along with the way he chewed the inside of his cheek when the weather was about to turn, and she filed both observations where she filed everything that might matter later. The proving ground came on a cutting day in late spring, when a young hen named Dell caught a hoof on a snag and opened his forearm from wrist to elbow on a rusted strand of wire. The cut was long and shallow and bleeding freely, and Dell stood holding it shut with his free hand while the crew gathered to do what crews do, which was to look at it and offer whiskey. Tucker pulled a tin of axle grease and turpentine from the tack box, the standard frontier answer for anything that bled, and started daubing it on, while Dell hissed through his teeth. Yucca came across the yard with the folded cloth and a small packet she had taken from the box, and she held both out to Tucker without a word. The packet held a washed powder, pale and faintly yellow, that she had ground for just this kind of wound, and the cloth was clean boiled linen. Tucker looked at the packet, looked at her, and the grin came back slow. He told her he reckoned not, that Dell's arm would mend fine with what God and the tack box provided, and he set the wager right there in the yard. He bet her dark brew was nonsense, and the stock remedy would have that arm closed in a week, and he said it loud enough that every man in earshot took a side without being asked. She drew the packet back into her palm and folded the cloth over it and walked to the cook shack, and she didn't look at the arm again. The stock remedy did its work the way stock remedies do, slowly and with a good deal of swearing, and Dell's cut closed in the better part of 2 weeks rather than the week Tucker had promised. The crew didn't notice the difference, because 2 weeks was still a mend, and a mend was a win on the frontier. Tucker counted it as a win, too, and the wager hardened into the house line, and the dark brew was nonsense by official decree of the Bar H. The laughter after that had a team sport quality to it, the kind of thing a crew does together, because doing it together is the point. Yucca's standing dropped a notch in the small unwritten ledger the bunkhouse keeps, the one that decides who gets the best cut of meat and who gets asked first when the work is hard. She felt the drop and didn't reach for it, because reaching was begging and she wouldn't beg. The box stayed locked, and the packet she had offered stayed in her palm and went back to its shelf, and she poured the bitter cup the next morning as though the wager had never been spoken. Hank had watched the whole thing from the porch of the ranch house, and he crossed the yard that evening while she was drawing water and did a thing he hadn't done before. He asked her if the arm would have mended faster with herb powder, and the question came low and without the grin, and she told him it would have mended in half the time. He didn't say anything back, just picked up the second bucket and carried it to the cook shack for her, and he set it inside the door and walked away, and the carrying of that bucket opened a small crack in a wall that had stood between them since the day he hired her. The crack was the thing the crew couldn't see, because the rancher who wouldn't let a widow beg was starting to choose her side without saying so. Farther out on the range, the weather the foreman had been chewing his cheek about for 2 days was building into the kind of long, grinding drive that breaks men and stock alike. The Bar H couldn't afford to lose a hand, and there was no question which hand held the crew together. What the crew didn't know was that the box they'd laughed at for 3 months was already aimed at the man who would need it most. The break came on the second morning of the drive, and it came without warning the way the worst breaks do. Tucker saddled up at first light with the crew, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge, he was swaying in the leather and calling out orders to a herd that had already stopped moving. Hank rode up alongside him and saw the foreman's face go gray and then white, and he pulled the man off the horse a half second before Tucker's knees gave out. They laid him in the bed of the buckboard and hauled him back to the ranch house at a trot, and the fever was on him before they got the tack off the team. It was the kind of fever Yuka knew, and she knew it the moment she saw the way his skin threw heat and the way his eyes wouldn't hold a single object steady. It rose in waves through the first day, breaking a sweat and then drying to a heat that felt like a stove door. And the rhythm of it was a rhythm she had sat with once before on a dirty blanket beside the Platte. She stood in the doorway of the ranch house room where they had put him, and she watched the doctor's work begin, and she held the key to the box in her fingers and didn't turn it. Doc Marsh arrived from town by midday, a tired, careful man with a worn bag and a competence that showed in his hands rather than his talk. He set up quinine in measured doses, and he ordered cool cloths changed on the hour, and he left a bottle of laudanum for the pain that came when the fever peaked each evening. He did what a frontier doctor could do, and he did it well, and the fever kept climbing through the first night as though none of it had touched it. By the second morning, the quinine hadn't broken it, and Marsh sat on the porch with Hank and told him plainly that he wasn't certain his kit could. The dread spread the way weather spreads on a ranch, slow and then everywhere at once. The crew came in off the range in 2s and 3s to stand in the yard and look at the ranch house door and not say much of anything. Out on the range the drive had stopped, the herd was drifting, and every hour the foreman stayed down was an hour the bar each bled money it didn't have. Hank hadn't slept, and the lines around his mouth had cut deeper in 2 days than they had in 2 years, and the cost of one man's fever was widening out past the man and past the ranch. The men handled it the way crews handle a thing they can't fix, by doing small useless jobs very hard. They mended tack that didn't need mending, and reshod horses that had been shod a week before, and stood at the corral fence looking toward the ranch house more than they looked at the stock. Wes, who had been loudest with the ditch water joke, was the quietest now, and as quiet had the shape of a man who has begun to suspect he was wrong about something and doesn't yet know how big the wrong is. A crew without its foreman is a hand without its thumb, and the Bar H was learning that in real time, and the lesson didn't make them kinder to the woman in the cook shack so much as it made them forget to be cruel. Yuka stood at the doorway a second time that evening, and the room held the same heat and the same restless breathing it had held on the Platte, and for a moment the 2 rooms were the same room. She had been too late that first time, too far from the box, and too unsure of her own hands, and the man she'd been trying to save had cooled on his own, without her help, and never warmed again. She didn't step into Tucker's room, only held the key and didn't turn it, and the holding back was its own kind of cost, and she was choosing not to choose yet. That night she sat alone in the cook shack with the box open on the table, and the packets lay in their rows under the lantern light, and the kettle ticked as it cooled. She had ground this formula once before, in a tent that smelled of wet canvas and dust, and she had poured it into a mouth that couldn't swallow well enough in time. The smell of the dried bark came up off the paper and mixed with the smell of the bitter brew she still made every morning, and the 2 smells were the same smell, and she sat with them a long time before she closed the lid. There was no lecture in it, only a woman and the tools her grandmother had given her, and the weight of the last time she had used them. By the third dawn, Tucker was delirious, calling out orders to a herd that wasn't there, and Doc Marsh came out of the room with his bag closed and his face set. He found Hank on the porch and told him in a voice low enough that the yard didn't hear that one more night, like the last, would finish the foreman. The clock was set, and it was said out loud, and the ranch house held its breath while Yuka stood once more in the doorway and held a key she hadn't yet turned. Marsh set it on the porch with his hat in his hands, and he set it the way a careful man admits a limit, without shame and without softening. He had tried the quinine in rising doses, and the cooling, and the laudanum for the pain, and the fever had eaten all three of them and kept its schedule. What he told Hank was that he had nothing left in the bag that was honest to try, and that he wouldn't pour laudanum into a dying man just to look like he was working. Then he asked carefully whether there was anyone on the place who knew something he didn't, and his eyes didn't go to the cook shack. Hank's eyes did. He stood up from the porch rail and crossed the yard to the cook shack door, and he didn't knock, because knocking would have made it an order, and he didn't want to give an order here. He asked Yuka to come, and the asking cost him something she could see in the way he held his shoulders. The small price a proud man pays to admit he needs help from someone his crew had been laughing at for 3 months. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the box on the shelf, and then she looked at him, and the look held long enough that he understood she wasn't refusing. She was measuring. She told him no once, and the no wasn't pride. The last time she had used this formula on a fever this far, along the man had died anyway because she had waited too long on the trail, and the dose had come too late to do its work. Hank heard the no and heard what was under it, and he said one short thing back, that Tucker wasn't on the trail and she wasn't too late yet. The words landed flat and plain between them, and the crack in the wall that had opened over the water bucket opened a little wider, and she reached for the key inside her collar. She carried the box into the ranch house and set it on the table beside the lamp, and she opened it in front of Hank and the doctor and the 2 hands who'd come to stand in the doorway. The lid came up on the paper packets in their rows, each labeled in a hand no one in the room could read, and on the small tools too fine for any frontier kitchen. In the doorway, the hands went quiet, in a way they hadn't gone quiet for 3 months, because a locked box of strange things is one thing and an open box of strange things is another. The mystery that had been a joke all spring became, in the lamplight, something the men didn't have a name for. She didn't teach them what it was. She named the pieces as she laid them on the cloth, a brown bark that smelled of cinnamon, a pale root the men would have called weed, a dark seed, and a sweeter root, and she named only what each was for in this fever. What she told Hank she needed was a clean iron pot, a strong fire, and one night, and she put it the way her grandmother had put it, as a statement of cost rather than a promise of cure. One of the hands in the doorway watched her lay the bark out, and his face changed, and the change was the only explanation the scene needed. The formula was for the first days of a fever, and the first days were nearly spent, which was the reason she had waited for the doctor to fail before she moved. She hadn't held back out of arrogance. She had held back because the medicine was a thing of timing, and timing was the thing she had gotten wrong on the Platte, and she wouldn't get it wrong twice by rushing in before she was sure the fever was the right kind at the right hour. The hour was now, and the kind was right, and the box was open, and the night was the price. The fire was built high in the cook shack stove, and the iron pot sat level on the grate, and the water came to a boil while the ranch held still around it. She ground the brown bark first, the one that smelled of cinnamon when it broke, and the smell cut through the cook shack and out the vent and across the yard in a way the bitter brew never had. Into the pot went the bark and the pale root and the dark seed, and the sweeter root, and she measured each with the small measure from the box, and didn't pour to a guess. The decoction darkened as it rolled, and the smell of it filled the room the way a real thing fills a room, and the men who came to the door to watch didn't call it ditch water now. She timed the boil the way her grandmother had timed it, by the look of the liquid rather than by any clock, and the look she waited for was a particular rolling color, dark and clear at once. That meant the roots had given up what they held. A watched decoction isn't so different from a watched fever, and she stood over the pot the way she had stood over her husband's blanket, only this time the watching was the doing of the cure and not the waiting for the end. When the color came right, she lifted the pot off the heat and set it on the iron trivet to steep, and the quiet that followed the boiling was the loudest thing in the cook shack. Her hands did the work, and her memory ran under it, and the two were the same current for the hour it took to brew. She had learned the proportions from her grandmother in a quiet room in Kyoto, kneeling on a mat, while the old woman's hands moved over the same measure, and the learning had been patient and exact and full of a respect the frontier didn't trade in. She had last brewed it in a trail tent with wet canvas walls, grinding the bark on a stone, while her husband burned beside her on the blanket, and she had been late that night, and the dose had been right, and the man had still been gone by morning. The formula was the same formula. The hands were the same hands. Only the hour was different, and the hour was the thing she was betting on. Tucker was delirious when she carried the pot across the yard, and he fought the first spoon the way a feverish man fights anything that comes at his mouth. A hand had to hold his head, and she was patient with the holding, and she tipped the dark liquid in small measures between his clenched teeth and waited for each swallow before she gave the next. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't hurry, and the contrast with 3 days of frantic dosing did its own work in the room without a line of comment from anyone. The pot went down by half, and then by more, and she set the spoon on the cloth and sat back on her heels and watched his breathing the way a woman watches a fire she has just lit. The night came on long and slow, and the bunkhouse filled with the smell of the decoction and the smell of the bitter brew at once, and for the first time the two smells shared a room without anyone laughing at either. Hank stayed. He didn't say much, and what he said was to the point, and he and Yuka shared the watch in a silence that had its own weight in it. There was a moment near midnight when she reached to check Tucker's forehead, and Hank passed her the lamp without being asked, and the passing was the recognition the old stories mean when they strip the easier words away, not love, not even trust, but the simple fact of two people who have seen the same hard thing and don't need to name it. A hand slipped in around 2 a.m. to look, and then another, and they stood in the door the way men stand at a sickbed they have no business attending, and they watched her dip the cloth and lay it and check the pulse at the wrist with 2 fingers. None of them had ever seen a fever work this way, with no rushing and no praying and no bottle poured in desperation, and the steadiness of her hands was a harder thing to dismiss than the brew had ever been. They left one at a time without speaking, and the silence they left behind was a different silence than the one they had brought, heavier on the side of respect and lighter on the side of doubt. Toward dawn, his breathing changed, and the change was small and plain, a settling in the chest where there had been a hitch for 3 days. She waited through it, and she didn't call anyone yet, because a fever that breaks once can rise again before the sun is up, and she had seen that too. The heat in his skin came down by degrees through the last dark hour, and when the first gray light came in the window, she laid the back of her hand against his forehead the way she had laid it against her husband's on the Platte. The skin was cool. She held her hand there a beat longer than she needed to, and then she drew it back, and she didn't smile. The fever didn't come back with the sun. She poured the last of the decoction out at the edge of the yard and scoured the pot with sand and set it to dry, and she did the cleaning the way she did everything, with the same hands and the same quiet and no performance in it. The saving of a man wasn't a thing she celebrated, because the last time she had stood over a cooled forehead, it had been a death and not a cure, and the two stood too close together in her for any celebration to find room. She had done the work, and the work had held, and that was all there was to say about it in the hour before the rest of the ranch woke. Tucker opened his eyes in the late morning and asked for food, and the asking was the plain proof the whole ranch had been waiting 3 days to hear. He was weak and he was clear, and the fever had left him the way a bad weather leaves a valley, all at once, and with the air washed behind it. Doc Marsh came back from town and stood over him and checked his forehead and his pulse and said nothing for a long, careful beat, and then he sat down on the edge of the cot and asked Yuka in a quiet voice what she had given him. She told him in one line the bark and the root and the seed and the sweet root, and he left it alone after that because a careful man knows when he's standing in front of something he doesn't own. The crew shifted in the small ways that a crew shifts when the unofficial ledger gets rewritten. The next morning a hand named Wes walked into the cook shack before the stove was hot and stood by the shelf with his own tin cup held out, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't grin. She poured him a measure of the bitter brew, the same dark cup she'd drunk alone for 3 months, and he drank it and made the face that the bitter always pulls and set the cup down and walked out. That was the whole of it, and the whole of it was enough. What had been ditch water was now something a man would stand in the cold to ask for, and no one had to call it anything for the change to be real. The change moved through the crew in a day the way the fever had moved through Tucker, slow and then everywhere. A man who had knocked her shoulder in the food line the month before stepped around her now and touched the brim of his hat when he did it, and the touch was small, and the smallness was the whole point. The cook shack, which had been her workplace and her exile at once, became a place men entered with their hats off and their voices down, and she didn't remark on the difference because remarking would have been a kind of collecting that she wouldn't do. She hadn't asked for the room to change, and the room changed anyway, and that was all she had needed and never once asked for. Tucker was the one who closed the mockery for good, and he did it the way a foreman does everything, with one flat line and no room left behind it. He was sitting up on the cot when the crew filed in to see him, and he looked across at the cup of broth she had left on the stove for him and told the men that the woman's medicine had done what the doctors hadn't, and that any man with a complaint about her brew could take it up with him. The reckon not tick didn't come because this wasn't a closing down of an argument. It was the end of one. The men nodded and went back to the range, and the ditchwater joke went out with them and didn't come back. Hank found her in the cook shack that evening, after the crew had eaten and the pots were clean and the lantern was turned low. He didn't thank her with a speech, because the voice of this ranch didn't run to speeches, and he didn't need to. What he did was change the small permanent things that decide where a person stands on an outfit, the place at the table, the door that gets answered first, the name that gets used instead of the label. He used her name for the first time in front of her, just the two of them in the low light, and the name sounded different in his mouth than it had in any mouth since Kyoto, and she heard it and didn't look away. The lacquered box went back on the shelf above her cot, and the pin key went back inside her collar, and the lock clicked shut the way it always did. Only now the lock was a habit rather than a defense, because the room that had laughed at the box had become a room that would carry water for the woman who owned it. She poured the bitter cup the next morning before dawn, the same dark brew in the same quiet hour, and the smell of it curled out the cook shack vent into a ranch that had finally decided to learn what it was. The box stayed unlocked on the shelf that next dawn, and a second cup sat beside hers at the cook shack table for the first time. She had saved the man who had mocked her, and she would never tell him she learned the cure from the husband. The same fever had taken on the Platte. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels, and if it moved you, hit that like button.